Hi everyone, welcome to our 15 to Life online chat. We have the 15 to Life filmmaker with us today. We also have two special guests. So congratulations on the 15 to Life broadcast premiere yesterday evening on PBS. The film will be streaming on the POV website for a limited time starting today until September 3rd, 2014. And I'd like to introduce our participants today. We have the 15 to Life filmmaker, Nadine Pequeneza. Do you want to say hi, Nadine?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming.
We also have Jody Kent Lavy, the director of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth.
Hello.
And then we have Jeanne Bishop, a Chicago public defender whose sister, brother-in-law, and their unborn child were killed by a teenager.
Hello.
So thank you all for joining us. And everyone who's watching, can you, just a reminder, submit your questions if you haven't already. So first of all, Nadine, could you just start by describing the film briefly for anyone who hasn't seen it yet?
Sure. The documentary is about a 14-year-old who was recruited by his mother's older drug dealer, 24-year-old, to rob some hotels. So over the course of 30 days, they robbed 4 hotels. Kenneth was caught and convicted and given 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. And so the documentary is about a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision that declared or ruled that sentence unconstitutional, the Graham decision, which came out in 2010. So the documentary follows his resentencing. So those life sentences were vacated, and then because of this U.S. Supreme Court decision, he had to be given a new sentence. So we follow that process and also look at his childhood and what led him into this situation.
Great, thanks. So could you just talk a little bit about how you came to make this film and what drew you to the subject?
What drew me to the subject is that I'd never heard of juvenile life without parole before, and it was a shock to me when I found out that kids as young as 13 years old were being sent to prison for life, to essentially die in prison. And so I started researching the issue and came across Kenneth's story in a local Tampa newspaper because he had applied for clemency in 2009. All of his opportunities for appeals had been used up, and clemency was his last chance, and that was denied in 2009. So it was after reading that article that I got in touch with his lawyer, Paolo Annino, who's at the Florida State University, and started talking to them about making a documentary.
Great. And then, Jeanne, could you describe your personal experience with teenage crime and how that influenced your work and your opinions about juvenile justice?
Sure. In 1990, my younger sister, Nancy Bishop Lambert, and her husband, Richard, and their unborn baby were murdered in their home by a 16-year-old. It was actually 1 month short of his 17th birthday. He had broken into their home with a .357 Magnum revolver. He shot my brother-in-law once in the back of the head, shot my sister Nancy, who was 25 years old and 3 months pregnant, in her side and abdomen, and left them there to die. He was arrested about 6 months later and convicted and sentenced to life without parole as a mandatory sentence for killing my sister and her husband, and was given life without parole as a discretionary sentence for killing the unborn baby.
Great. And what do you think of Kenneth's situation?
I thought that the film very movingly portrayed the kind of astonishment that he had when he learned, you know, the sentence that he was actually facing. I think that people as young as he was probably can't even comprehend it. I know in my work as a public defender, very often when I'll convey an offer from the state's attorney to my clients, it'll be a number so large and so shocking that they actually can't even to take it in. So I think it was a very vivid portrayal of kind of the mind of someone at that age as they're trying to process the criminal justice consequences that they're facing.
Mm-hmm. And then, Jody, could you describe your work with the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth and how you got involved in this type of advocacy?
Sure. So the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth works to end the practice of sentencing children to life in prison without the possibility of parole. We're the only country in the world known to impose the sentence on children, and so our organization is dedicated to working with those individuals around the country, advocates, lawyers, family members of people serving, formerly incarcerated individuals, victims' families, national partners who all believe that we can do better by our children and that our society would be better off if we had age-appropriate alternatives that take into account children's capacity for change, their unique characteristics, and so we're pursuing reform through a number of approaches: advocacy, litigation, public education, organizing. Personally, I came to this work having volunteered in juvenile halls out in Los Angeles, where I lived many years ago, and I was just struck by the number of young people we had locked up, sort of thrown the key away on these young people, and the fact that many of them had had very challenging upbringings that were very unlike my own, and I knew that had I been in their circumstances, I would have ended up in the very same place. And I'll never forget a 15-year-old child telling me he had no hope for his life. And I think about him every day, and know that there are many more young people out there without hope, and that there's nothing more hopeless than being sentenced to die in prison. So very grateful for the opportunity to work with both Jeanne and Nadine as we try to educate people about this practice and bring about age-appropriate reforms.
So how does Kenneth's case compare to the other cases you've seen?
Sure. I mean, Kenneth's case is similar in a number of ways and differs in some. First of all, it's similar in that, he had been exposed to trauma and violence as a child, like most of the young people who've been sentenced to life without parole. It was also similar in that he had an older co-defendant. As we know, young people are more susceptible to peer pressure than adults, and this is an obvious case of that. And in fact, this is a case where his older co-defendant actually got a lesser sentence than Kenneth, and we see that in large part because young people don't have the same ability to navigate the legal system that adults do, and Jeanne, of course, can speak to that in her experience as a public defender. It's also similar in that black youth are 10 times more likely than white youth to receive these extreme sentences, and so unfortunately, these sentences are not handed out in a racially just way, and certainly we have a lot of work to do to raise awareness about that and address that issue. It's also similar in that we could see how Kenneth grew up. He was a teen at the time of the crime. He obviously was under pressure from a lot of different aspects of his life, and he also was able to grow and become rehabilitated. We know that people serving these sentences, some of them for 3 or 4 decades, are still in prison and will never get out unless we change our laws, but are fully rehabilitated at this point and no longer pose a risk to society. I think it's different in that Kenneth was convicted of a non-homicide crime, which is what the Supreme Court addressed in Graham v. Florida in 2010. And we know that the majority of the people who are serving these sentences are in for homicide crimes. That said, most of them were first-time offenders, and many of them were not the shooters. About a quarter of them were, in fact, not the shooters. And so it's not like we're reserving these sentences for the most serious criminals, as many people believe. When you start to look a little bit deeper into these cases, as Nadine so beautifully did in her documentary, you get a better glimpse of the fact that this is not a fair sentence, not only because it's not appropriate for any child, but when you look at who's being given these sentences, it's particularly problematic.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question from a viewer, Mark Osler, and anyone can answer this one. It's, what would be an ideal review panel for these cases? Are there good templates to look at among the states?
I'll jump in on that one. One of the things that I'd like to see is to have people from corrections. I think that the prison officers that see my clients every day have a really good idea of who is safe to get out and who's not. I think we should have teachers, child psychologists, all sorts of people that we don't typically see, at least in my state of Illinois, on our prisoner review board.
And Jody or Nadine, anything to add?
I think we need to make sure that people who understand child development have the ability to weigh in and look at how young people have changed over time. Part of the problem with these sentences is that they're handed out through the adult criminal justice system, right, which is equipped to handle adults. Some would argue it's not even equipped to do that, but nonetheless, it was set up to handle, you know, adults, and so it doesn't take into account the unique characteristics of children. It doesn't take into account our understanding of how of how children change. And there's really no other industry where we have people, you know, handling children, and no other industry where people do not receive specified training for dealing with children the way we have with the adult criminal justice system. We don't let teachers work with children unless they're certified. We don't let doctors work with children unless they have specialized training. And yet parole officials, judges, and even defense attorneys in many cases who are working with young people don't necessarily have the kind of training that they should have to deal with the kind of the special characteristics that we know, come along with working with children.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, in making the film, I mean, you see in the judge who is resentencing Kenneth that his understanding of what it means to be raised by a crack-addicted mother, it's almost unfair to expect that a judge would know all the nuances of that and what the ramifications are and the kind of impact that can have on a child. So I think having these specialized individuals, experts in the field of dealing with not just children, but also children who've been through traumatic situations in these review panels is important.
Mm-hmm. So Nadine, you know Kenneth personally. After losing the appeal, how does he motivate himself now to stay positive and keep fighting to get out of jail earlier?
That, I think, is a very difficult thing, and I think he goes up and down. It's been almost 3 years since he was resentenced, and in that time, you know, we've continued to write to each other, and his mood changes. He goes through difficult periods. I, myself, was completely surprised after the resentencing because the interview that we did with him was actually an hour and a half after he'd received that sentence, and the fact that he wasn't completely depressed, I found astonishing. But from talking to advocates like Jody, who've been doing this work, I hear that that's not uncommon, that these kids, these people who were sentenced as children have this remarkable capacity and perseverance. And so that, I think, should say something about their ability to create lasting changes in their lives and who they are. If they can keep up this hope for so many years and decades even, then I think that's a good indication of what they could be capable of on the outside.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a question from Angela Taylor, and she asked, is there any way to send letters of support to Kenneth? I would like for him to know how inspirational I find him and that I will be praying for him.
Absolutely. You can actually find his, on the Department of Corrections of Florida has a website where you can search for an offender and find their location. And because it's public information, I am assuming it's okay for me to tell you that he's in the Charlotte Correctional Facility, which is just outside Fort Myers, and you can write to him there.
Great. And Nadine, how did you establish trust with Kenneth and his family, and how did you develop a relationship with him despite the difficulty of visiting him?
Mm-hmm. It was difficult, and I'm actually, this is another thing that amazed me, is that Kenneth agreed to do the documentary without ever having met me. And so I sent him a letter. I spoke with his lawyer, Paolo Annino, at length. You know, we had a number of conversations. Paolo reviewed some of my previous work. And I think it was, one, what I wrote in my letter to Kenneth, but also the relationship that I had established with his lawyer. And obviously, Kenneth had been working with Paolo by that time for at least 6 or 7 years, so they had a good relationship. And I think that's probably a lot of the reason that Kenneth took up my offer. But I also think that you know, there was a lot at stake for him, obviously, in this resentencing trial. but I think part of him felt that having it documented could help, would be beneficial in getting his story out there. And then his mother, I think, felt the same, even more so in some respects, because of the circumstances of Kenneth's situation, has a lot of guilt about what happened, and so I think she really wanted to do everything she could to try and get her son a second chance.
And then we have a question from Dane Evans. He says, I was curious to know how you gained such exclusive access to the courtroom during the trial.
I can't take a lot of credit for that, except for putting in the request first. So the sunshine laws in Florida give media access to most court cases unless for exceptional reasons it's closed. And the rule in Tampa is they always allow one media crew inside, and then all of the footage that we film has to be available to news crews in case they want to film something. So it was really about getting Kenneth's agreement to participate and his lawyers. The court wasn't that difficult. Getting into prison was a little bit more difficult, and in fact, since I interviewed Kenneth in the Falkenberg jail where he was awaiting his resentencing, I was not able to access him in any of the other prisons where he's been held.
Okay. And then, despite 2 Supreme Court rulings, institutional changes at the state level seem slow and inadequate concerning juvenile sentencing. Do you believe that policy would be better served working at the state or national level? And anyone can answer this question.
So I'm happy to start. I think that it is likely to take some time, frankly, to address some of the issues raised by the Supreme Court. I would actually be concerned if states were all acting very quickly, because what we've seen following Graham and Miller is that the states that have been quick to act and try to come up with sort of quick fixes have been very short-sighted in their approaches to reform. So I'm actually pleased that some states are starting to actually give some real thought to how we should be holding our young people accountable for serious crimes. You know, we know that these sentences have come about over the course of several decades when laws were passed following the super predator theory and the hype that came about as a result of that. There was this theory that these, godless, fatherless monsters were, young black boys were going to come and haunt neighborhoods near you. And what followed that was, these theories that there was going to be a spike in juvenile crime among these young super predators, and as a result, there were tough on crime policies passed at the state level that made it easier to try children as adults at younger and younger ages. And at the same time, we saw truth in sentencing happening, mandatory minimums that made these adult sentences that were given to children harsher and harsher. And so the confluence of those laws have led to where we are now. The court has stepped in saying children are different. We cannot treat them the same way that we treat adults. We have to, reserve the harshest penalties for adults. And as a result, we're seeing states start to consider how to hold young people accountable for serious crimes. The juvenile justice system was set up for young people, and that's where all children need to be in order to ensure that they get the rehabilitative services that they're uniquely qualified for. So we're hopeful that with more education, with sharing this film and other information that is out there showing how kids are fundamentally different than adults, that policymakers will be thoughtful in their approaches. West Virginia passed a very thoughtful law that had broad bipartisan support this year that creates meaningful opportunities for release for any child tried as an adult after no more than 15 years. And that's exactly the kind of reform that we believe states need to be adopting in order to make sure that kids get a second chance at life and actually do have an opportunity to prove their ability to change.
Just to add that I know that there are things moving along simultaneously on multiple tracks in the federal and the state level. I know that Jody and a group of distinguished academics, human rights people, People from Northwestern University Law School have been having high-level meetings in Washington talking about federal issues. In my own state of Illinois, we have not only laws to reform the juvenile justice system, and specifically these life sentences, pending in the legislature the past couple of sessions, haven't been passed yet, but definitely negotiations are ongoing. But at the same time, there are about 99 people serving juvenile life without parole sentences in Illinois, that most of whom have already filed petitions in court to be resentenced, including the person who killed my family member. So he's already back in court on a petition. All of these things are kind of on hold while we're waiting to see if my state appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court about whether the Miller versus Alabama case holding mandatory juvenile life without parole sentences unconstitutional are retroactive. In other words, does that decision apply to all of these 99 young people who are serving the sentence or not?
Thanks. And then, do you believe that after 30 years, the system will have prepared Kenneth for positive integration into society, or do you feel that the time will have passed to lead a productive and independent life? Anyone can answer this one as well.
I can start. I find it hard to conceive of how someone who spent 2/3 of their life in prison and comes out at age 45 will easily adapt. I mean, I know it's possible. I know it's happening. I know there are people who have been released under Miller in their early 40s, and some have gone back to school. Some are getting married, after being a year out. I know it is happening, but I can't help but think it's more difficult. And it would seem to me that if someone is deemed to be rehabilitated at age 26, it would make more sense to let them out earlier when they still have an opportunity to go back to school, to start, if not a career, at least to get themselves established in the job market, to buy a house, to start a family, like all of the things that we know make people good citizens, that help them to contribute, that they become a part of society. So if that's what our ultimate goal is, it seems to me counterproductive to let them out when half of their life is over and when they've spent the majority of it in prison.
One of the things that has really struck me, I've been visiting my sister's killer in prison, and one of the things that struck me is how over time all of the things he was able to participate in to try to rehabilitate himself have been gradually taken away. He started out being able to take college courses. Those were eliminated. He was able to play a musical instrument, be in a band. That was eliminated. He was able to write stories on a typewriter. That was taken away. Not because of any disciplinary infraction of his, but because all of these programs were taken away for all prisoners who were that sentence, to the point where there's very little that they can even do to demonstrate their rehabilitation, which is participate in it. That's one thing. The other thing, as a victim's family member, it would be very helpful to address a problem that came up in a conference the other day, where we were training lawyers to do these types of cases with juveniles, trying to get resentencing for them. One of the issues that came up is that when you've been in prison for so long, and the focus is on you and your case and your defense, and there's no contact with victims, no exposure even generally to the issues that victims family members might have, there's a perceived lack of empathy or a perceived lack of remorse among the offenders that really plays out when they come into court and are called on to make a statement on their own. And that's something that I think the system desperately needs and could greatly benefit from.
I would just add, first of all, I think that, to Jeanne's point, just to add, I think that there is certainly a need for better supportive services for victims' families, especially as some of these people who were sentenced to life without parole do come up for resentencing and for parole. The level of services out there now are grossly inadequate, and we support the services available to these people who are experiencing a huge change and reliving some of the most horrible experiences that they've had. And so we know that that's a critically important part of this. I want to go back for a moment to the question about, you know, the timing for release. I mean, we know that the vast majority of young people age out of criminal behavior in their early to mid-20s. You know, there's data that shows that that's the case. They grow up and they, you know, get their acts together and make better decisions. In addition, we know that their brains are fully developed by age 25. If you look at insurance policies, they all reflect that. You know, that's sort of a common held understanding. And so, you know, we believe that we need to check in on these young people after their brains are fully developed, and we know that there's a lesser chance that they, a much lesser chance that they will recidivate in their mid to late 20s. And periodically thereafter, because, you know, if they're not changed then, they might be later on. But I think it is important that even as there are these laws changing, if they don't come at the point that we believe is the right point, that doesn't mean that these young people over time can't change on their own. Certainly there is a lack of rehabilitative services, and as Jeanne pointed out, you know, people serving these sentences are often excluded from the few programs that exist. But I have seen some of the most incredible resilience in these people who, you know, given a bus token after 40 years in prison and told to go home and, you know, make a life for themselves, you know, we've seen people succeed, and it's just incredible. And so I think it's certainly important to create supports for the victims, for the people coming out, for the families, and certainly our society could do much better at all of those things. But we certainly believe that a meaningful opportunity for release is, you know, is what the court has required and what these people deserve, even if it is, you know, later in life, past a time that we believe they should get out.
And what can someone do if they want to show support or become engaged in questions concerning juvenile justice?
Well, certainly there are a lot of people interested in reform efforts. We're working exclusively on this issue. We work in most states with partners, so certainly people can come to our website at www.fairsentencingofyouth.org, sign up for our newsletter to get updates about what's going on. We also like to plug people into what's going on in their states on this issue. And there are a variety of other organizations working on related juvenile justice issues, but we are happy to put people in touch. There is always great need for people to get involved and, you know, and join the movement, if you will.
In Illinois, Human Rights Watch has really been a leader in this. It's a wonderful organization and always in need of support.
And then, Nadine, what were your hopes with the film? What reactions and discussions did you hope to await?
Well, I was hoping that people would be able to look at these children who are getting sentenced to these extremely long terms of imprisonment as people, as opposed to just children who committed this one act of violence. And so I wanted them to be able to understand them as complete people, so with a background and a history and you know, a difficult childhood and circumstances around why they got involved. And that's really why I wanted to focus on one person in the film. It's, even though there's more than 2,500 kids who've received this sentence, this is really why I focused on one, because I thought in order for people to really come to know Kenneth, we needed to spend some time with him. So I'm hoping by doing that, it will change the way people look at all of these cases.
And are you going to continue following Kenneth's case in the next few years?
Definitely going to keep in touch with him and Paolo, and we're waiting to see what's going to happen with the appeal. Right now, they're appealing to the federal court because they believe that the resentencing judge didn't consider Kenneth's rehabilitation as he was mandated to under the Graham decision. And so, yes, we're following that, and we're waiting to see what happens.
Great. And did making the film change any of your preconceptions about the justice system?
I was very surprised by the sentence that was delivered at the end of Kenneth's resentencing. I thought that Kenneth's lawyers had done a good job of demonstrating that he was rehabilitated, that he was a model prisoner, that his circumstances were very difficult growing up and unusual, being involved in a crime with his mother's drug dealer. He didn't seem to me to be a threat to society, so I was really expecting that his sentence would be greatly reduced, if not that he was released, because they did have a program for him to go into. There's a transition house. They had a number of things in place to help him in that transition. So I would say the most surprising thing to me was the sentence that was delivered.
And could you describe the process of making the film and how long it took?
Sure. I started doing research for the film in mid-2011. Read a number of reports and visited websites and talked to people who work in organizations like Jody's, with Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, and then found Kenneth's case after deciding that I thought it would be best to focus on one. So I approached his lawyer, got Kenneth's permission, and then filming began shortly after that because the resentencing was planned for October 2011. And for a while, Paolo was thinking that he might actually get a negotiated settlement sentence, and that it would never go to a hearing. And so we were waiting. We weren't sure if it was going to go forward. And then when Paolo told me a couple of weeks before that it was going to happen, so we started filming. And then from that point on, it was a number of appeals that Kenneth was going through, and during that time is when we met all the people who were involved in his original trials and his childhood, and started filming the backstory of Kenneth's childhood and how he got involved in the crimes.
And are there any other documentary filmmakers who inspire you or influenced your work?
Sure, there's lots. Obviously, Errol Morris is a big one. Barbara Koppel, I love her work. Barbara Koppel. And, the fellows who did Paradise Lost. That's a film about the justice system that also obviously struck a nerve in the United States and around the world, and led to the freeing of a prisoner, 3 prisoners to be exact. So, yeah, those people have inspired me over the years.
Great, thanks. And this question's for everyone, and it's from James Ross. What are some success stories from people who went to jail as kids but got out later?
There's a wonderful young man in Illinois named Evan Griffith who had a horrific childhood, was abused by an older person who took him in when he was homeless, and was sent to prison and was in a fight there, and another death resulted again, and was given a life without parole sentence. Completely rehabilitated, and has since been released, working, living a very productive life, speaking out as a very articulate and eloquent voice for reform of this sentence. He actually helped participate in the training of lawyers the other day at a law school here in Chicago. And he's just a wonderful example to me of someone who I think not only says, I'm rehabilitated, I followed all the rules in prison, but who really gets it. He really gets that when a human life is taken, there's an obligation, in a sense, to try to redeem your own life and to live in a way that is honorable and meaningful and productive, and it's just very heartening to see how he is living that out every day.
Yeah, we have the privilege of working with a number of people who've been incarcerated for crimes committed as youth. We have one individual on our staff, Xavier McElrath, who's actually based there in Chicago, and he has established a network called ICAN. It stands for Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network, and it is a group of people who were convicted of some of the most serious crimes as children, who are out now, who are doing well. They serve as very positive examples for how young people can change and give back, and how they can really contribute to our communities. They do work directly in the communities where these young people are coming from, where the violence is occurring, to try to help them understand a different way, to see some positive narratives, positive examples of people succeeding from their communities, because so often all they see are the negative images in the media of the violence and of the devastation that's occurring. And they speak to decision makers, policymakers, judges, and others who have the ability to really rethink some of these policies and these laws and give these young people a second chance. There's one person who comes to mind right now, Sarah Cruzan, who some people have heard of. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for killing her pimp when she was 16 years old, after being abused by him since she was 11. She was sentenced in California, and Governor Schwarzenegger commuted her sentence to 25 years to life. And then she was resentenced and released last October after nearly 2 decades in prison. She's currently in flight on her way to Washington, D.C., her first time ever flying. She's joining us here for a youth summit with Xavier and another formerly incarcerated youth who are going to be participating in a film screening of 15 to Life tomorrow afternoon, and facilitating a conversation with young people from across the country. It's sponsored by the Department of Justice and our coalition partners, the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. So that's just a very sort of concrete way, these people are not only, just extraordinary examples of how people change, but also are really trying to, shape the way young people think and behave and, understand and have hope.
Great. And it seems like many people are surprised to hear about the juvenile sentencing laws in the United States. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because they're so unusual. Juvenile life without parole is a sentence that exists only in the United States, and so I think it takes many people by surprise. And although it's happening in the United States, I found in making the documentary many of the people that I talked to had never heard of the practice, and were quite surprised to find out that it was happening in their country. So I think they're surprised because it's unusual and it's not well known.
Yeah, I think, it also is part of the problem with the fact that the communities that are impacted most by both the violence and these sentences are just generally disenfranchised and don't have the same platforms to express outrage about these practices. So I think that that's something that we're trying to change through amplifying the voices of people directly impacted, formerly incarcerated youth, victims' families, and the families of the people serving the sentence, because it is a human rights violation. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, which every country in the world, associated with the UN has ratified, with the exception of the U.S. and Somalia, says, explicitly prohibits these sorts of sentences. And so, we should all be outraged by this practice. We claim to be a beacon of human rights for our, for the international community, and yet we are so far off the charts in this practice. It's just unlike anything you see anywhere else in the world. I mean, in Europe, the maximum sentence children could ever face, runs the gamut between 15 and 30 years, maximum. And that's what people are talking about as minimum sentences in the context of the debates now following the Supreme Court decision. So, I think we have a lot to learn from the international community about how to hold our children accountable in age-appropriate ways.
I think one of the reasons it's surprising, too, is that Professor Barkasser makes this point strongly, which is that we protect children in so many other ways in this country. So we don't let them drink, serve in the military, we vote till a certain age. And yet, at a very young age, we're willing to say, we're going to lock you up for this one crime you committed and never let you out, no matter how sorry you may be, no matter how rehabilitated you may be someday. And I think it's kind of a symptom of a larger problem in the United States of really feeling that we can incarcerate our way out of a problem, that we can incarcerate our way out of the problem of youth violence when there are so many complex causes to have this one simplistic cookie-cutter solution that hasn't worked. And so I think that now, you know, we're kind of rethinking this as a nation, not just the juvenile life sentences, but mass incarceration, over sentencing of nonviolent drug offenders. I think we're having a very welcome conversation right now about what has failed and what needs to change.
And then we have a question from Lucy Lewis, and she says, I noticed that Kenneth was denied parole in 2013, and you are appealing that decision. What are the chances now that his story has become public? Do you think he would have a better chance at parole if his story was exposed even more?
I hope so. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I make documentaries like this, is to get people to change the way they think, or at least look at other perspectives. So we don't know, obviously, what's going to happen. They still don't even know if the federal court will hear the appeal. Paolo and Nino's lawyers just filed the petition, so we're really we're waiting to hear.
And then Nadine, what was the biggest challenge making your film?
I would say the biggest challenge was gaining Paolo and Nino's trust and the trust of his lawyers, because obviously his first priority is to Kenneth, and I respect that and I understand it, but at the same time, as a filmmaker, I want to film what's happening. I want access to everything that's going on, so that when I tell the story, it's the most true presentation of what happened. And so at times Paolo was nervous about that, because he didn't want anything to be filmed or said or get out about the documentary before the court was able to render its sentence. And so we had an agreement like that on paper, but I think it was always in the back of his mind, how could this potentially play against my client? And so that's something that we were continually talking about while we were filming. And you know, the part of the agreement was that the film would not be released until the appeal was completed. And so the appeals within Florida at that time, it had gone already to the 2nd District Appeal Court, and they had applied to the Florida Supreme Court, which had denied to hear the case, said it was outside their jurisdiction. So at that point, Paolo felt comfortable going forward with the film, allowing me to show it to people.
Great. And then we have a question from Matthew Gritzmacher. To what degree does the work to end life without parole for kids have support from elected officials and others within the government?
I found here in Illinois that as we've lobbied, it's been a real challenge, even among people that we assumed would support these types of reforms, because there is this fear that they're going to be challenged in the primary when their seat comes up for re-election, and someone will use that familiar accusation that you're soft on crime, that you're letting murderers out of prison. And so having people to be able to summon the courage to do the principal things they know is right, irrespective of that fear, has been a real challenge for us legislatively.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that while we have seen some conservative support, the Right on Crime initiative, which is made up of of leaders who are from the conservative movement working toward criminal justice reform. They made ending life without parole for children a priority among their juvenile justice priorities. So, this issue does have support from people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. However, I think it's critically important for people to hear from their constituents that this is an issue they care about and that they want to see reform for the reasons that Jeanne identified. People are always concerned about being reelected, and it's rare that you see anyone reelected because of a progressive reform that they've pursued on criminal or juvenile justice. There just hasn't been a lot of political will there, and so we need to create that, and that's why there's a real need for participation from everyone out there who is concerned about this issue, and that's why it's so great to have a film like this one that really raises awareness among people who might not otherwise know that we sentence our children to die in prison, and hopefully with the outrage that follows under coming to that conclusion and with that information, that people will get involved, contact their legislators, and tell them that they want to see something done about this inhumane practice.
In the film, Brian Stevenson, who's a advocacy lawyer, with the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, he called it the politics of fear and anger. And for me, that really describes what it is. It's much easier to put children in prison for these long periods of time than it is to deal with the root causes that Jeanne was talking about earlier, with poverty, substance abuse, lack of educational supports for children who are having difficulty in school, mental illness, all of these things that are contributing factors to kids ending up in these horrible situations. These are big problems. They're big social problems that need a lot of attention, and they need funding. They need resources to deal with them. So I think it's easier for politicians to say, we'll just lock these people up and the problem will go away.
And then for those of us in New York, what does the situation look like for juveniles in New York State?
So in New York State, there actually aren't any youth sentenced to life without parole that we know of. However, in New York and North Carolina, these are the only two states in the country. The age of adult jurisdiction is automatically 16. So that means that 16 and 17-year-olds are automatically tried in adult criminal court and face adult penalties. There's no discretion by judges to try them in juvenile court or give them the opportunity for juvenile detention. They're automatically tried and treated as adults. So I know there is an effort underway in New York to raise the age of adult jurisdiction to 18. The governor, I believe, has just appointed a commission to study this issue and try to address it. But it is a huge part of the problem, certainly, which is, treating children as adults in this context, unlike any other. As Jeanne mentioned earlier, we don't let them serve in the military, we don't let them drink, we don't let them, get married, enter into contracts, serve on juries, and yet we have no problem once they make a mistake giving up all responsibility to them, for them, by trying them in the adult criminal justice system, and that's a very big issue right now in New York.
And then we have a question on Twitter from Social Media Girl. She says, at what point are offenders considered to have paid their debt to society?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the things that came up as we were working on legislation to reform these sentences is, when should that first review come? Should it, obviously the family members of those serving the sentence wanted it to be as low as 10 years. Some of the family members of the victims wanted it to be, as high as 30 years or something. And finding where you draw that line is tough. I mean, part of it, from my perspective as a criminal defense lawyer, the sentencing range for an adult who does a armed robbery with a gun where no shot was fired, no one's even hurt, is a minimum of 21 years and a maximum of 45. So to have something substantially less than that for murder, even by a juvenile, proportionally feels wrong. So there's a whole landscape in which we're looking at the answer to that question.
Yeah, I have difficulty even explaining what that means, debt to society, and it's a difficult, complex concept, and I think it's up to a society to determine what exactly they mean by that. And there's a number of reasons that we send people to prison. safety, public safety is probably paramount. I would say most people feel that. The other is rehabilitation, and then there's punishment. But in dealing with juveniles, the whole reason the juvenile justice system was set up was to focus on rehabilitation, because people recognized that there was an opportunity for that with children. So especially when we're talking to about children, I have a hard. I really don't know what people mean when they say debt to society. And I would think the best way to make amends for something you have done is, one, by having a relationship with the people that you've hurt, apologizing, and really meaning that, and then also coming back to your community and contributing in a way that is helpful.
Great, thanks. And then Nadine, so what was the most difficult part of making an independent film?
I would say the most difficult part is never really knowing that you're 100% going to be able to complete it, because funding for documentary film is very difficult to get, and to fundraising takes a lot of time and takes a large part of the effort that you have. So I would say that's one of the most difficult things. With this film in particular, what was the most difficult is going through this experience with Kenneth, because it was very emotional for everybody who was involved, both his family and his lawyers, who had become very close to Kenneth, and then obviously for Kenneth himself. And so going through that process with them was extremely emotional for me and for the entire crew that was there. Our sound man and cameraman were deeply affected by what they saw, and the relationship that they developed with Kenneth as well.
And then on the flip side, what's the most enjoyable thing about making independent films, and why do you do it?
I love showing a film to audiences. I love getting to talk to them and to hear their reactions, both good and bad. And I love it when people disagree about something and there's an interesting conversation that ensues. So for me, that's the most gratifying part of making a film, is showing it to people and sharing their reactions with them.
And then if you had one piece of advice for a first-time filmmaker, what would it be?
Do a story that you really believe in. Do something that matters to you. Don't think about what will sell commercially or what you can get funding for, or whether it can be in a theater or not. Do a film that matters to you, and follow that.
Great. And then have you stayed in contact with Kenneth and his family?
Yes, yeah. I still write to Kenneth, and I get information from his lawyers. I call in for updates, and I speak to his mother on the phone. I call her, and I actually went to visit her in April to show her the film. So yes, I stay in touch.
What was her reaction to the film?
She was very moved by it. It was emotional for her watching the film. I mean, I think it was like being back there on that day. She was especially moved when Kenneth was describing their relationship, because I think Stephanie is still dealing with a lot of coming to terms with the role that she played in Kenneth's crimes that he committed. And so it was tough for her to watch, but at the same time she thanked us for making it. She was glad that the film was done, and she was happy to have it out there.
Great, thanks. And then if you could all just describe what you're working on now, like Nadine, what new films you're working on.
Sure, right now I'm working on a film about gun culture in Canada. We're not like the United States, but we do have gun owners in Canada who are looking to the United States as a model for the type of regulations they would like to see here. And I don't know if I told the people at the beginning that I'm based in Toronto, Canada. So that's why the film on gun culture in Canada. And so we're actually the only country in the world right now that's repealing gun control legislation. And so really it's a documentary from the perspective of gun owners about what role they would like to see guns have in our society.
I'm working on 3 things right now. One is that I'm helping train lawyers who are doing these resentencing hearings. We just spoke on a panel the other day at a law school in Chicago. I'm working still with the coalition of people that are trying to pass the legislation in my state that would reform our state juvenile life without parole sentences. So we have a strategy meeting coming up in a couple of days. And I have a book coming out in March of 2015 called Change of Heart. And it's about this whole journey of starting from supporting juvenile life without parole sentences for my sister's killer to no longer supporting that sentence for him or any other child, and visiting him in prison, and the whole journey of faith that led to that decision.
Mm-hmm. I'm just looking forward to reading Jeanne's book. And yeah, at the campaign we are working on a number of fronts to continue to raise awareness. We're working with Nadine to hold screenings in various parts of the country where there are active campaigns underway to scale back these extreme sentences for children. We're working to build a robust national coalition to demonstrate that there is real broad support for reform. We just, the National Association of Counties, which represents county officials across the country, just passed a resolution opposing life without parole sentences for children, and arguing that any reforms should be retroactive and apply to those people on the inside. So that certainly, you know, is a step in the right direction. And so, yeah, we're working at the state level to try to see about reforms through the courts and the legislatures, and continuing to engage those directly impacted so that their stories and their voices are amplified, and that you know, the community, particularly our policymakers, are more educated and informed as they approach these challenging issues.
Great, thanks. And then as a final question, just if you have one thing that you each would want an audience to take away from 15 to Life, what would that be?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'll go, you go, Jeanne. Go.
No, I was just going to say, I hope they take away that these are human beings. They're individuals. They're unique children of God, made in God's image, and that no one should be subject to the kind of blunt instrument of the laws that we've applied to these unique young people.
Yeah, I think that's right, and just building on that, I think that for people who come away as appalled as we are about the fact that we sentence our children to die in prison, and take away the hope of a second chance, you know, I think if people are appalled, that they'll get involved and they'll join us in our efforts to see about really reforming these policies and creating age-appropriate alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can follow up on that. Every time we show the film, people say, I'm so angry. And so don't go away angry. Ask what you can do. Go to the website. You can go to the film's website, 15 to Life, thefilm.com, or you can go to the CFSY website. There's lots you can do. There are lots of organizations working on this issue, and so you can get involved.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for a great conversation, and thank you to everyone who wrote in questions. We had some great questions today. And everyone can continue the conversation on social media with the hashtag 15 to Life. And 15 to Life will be available for full streaming online starting today until September 3rd, 2014 on the POV website. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.